Great. Welcome, everybody. My name is Pravin Krishna, and it's a great pleasure and honor for me to chair this session with our keynote speaker, Dr. Anantha Nageswaran, who's currently the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. In that role, he serves as the primary advisor to the Indian government on a wide variety of issues concerning the domestic economy, as well as India's links with the international economy. And over the years, we've had the benefit of his very articulate, creative, and analytically incisive views on a wide number of issues ranging from macroeconomics, international trade, health and education, as well as a global coordination for climate action and India's sort of particular role in it. Our topic today concerns geo-economic fragmentation, which broadly refers to this kind of emerging pattern of reversal of global economic integration, sparked in part by economic challenges as a result of globalization, sparked in part by geopolitical tensions around the world, a phenomenon with potential implications that are of increasing concern to economists and policymakers worldwide. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Nageswaran. Let me just say that he'll speak for about 25 minutes or so, and then we should have plenty of time for questions and answers after that before we break for lunch. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Pravin, for those kind words of introduction. My sincere thanks to the Deepak Karnira Raj Center for Indian Policies for inviting me for the second time. I was here in April, and at that time I spoke about the Indian economy, and this time Ruchir has decided that I should speak about the geo-economic fragmentation. But however, during the Q&A, if you have any specific questions on the Indian macro picture, I'll be happy to take them as well. And both Praveen and I promised Ruchi that we will give him back some 5-10 minutes since we are running behind schedule so that we don't eat into a lunchtime. So I'll try to save my remarks and confine them to about 25 minutes or so. In general, when we use these phrases like fragmentation, segmentation, etc., they normally have a slight negative connotation, just as words like innovation, predictability, and transparency used in the financial market space and in macro or monetary policy making, they carry a positive connotation. So it's very difficult for somebody to stand up and say, I'm against innovation, I'm against predictability and transparency. Although that kind of a nuanced approach is needed, predictability and transparency towards what end? And what are the costs and benefits of innovation? Whom do they serve? So those kinds of questions need to be asked. Similarly, the word fragmentation and segmentation, etc., carry a negative connotation. But let me tell you something. I want to leave this thought with you before I go into my prepared remarks. When financial markets are completely integrated as they have been, you really get no diversification opportunity. One market sets the tone for everybody else in the world. There is only one single market, one single beta. And whether it is in bond markets or equity markets, sometimes we feel it's good to have fragmented or segregated markets because you will really have diversification opportunities. So in other words, and the second mistake we always do is when we talk of geo-economic fragmentation, we lament the fragmentation. But we don't really go into the issue of why and what caused it to arise in the first place. Without doing so, there is really not much hope if we believe that geo-economic fragmentation is a bad thing to happen. Then there is really no way we can fix it unless we understand what gave rise to it in the first place. So with those initial remarks to set the context, let me just start with John Maynard Keynes. In one of his seminal pieces, The Economic Consequences of Peace, which he wrote about the early 20th century London, and I quote, "The inhabitants of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth, in such quantity as he might see fit, and reasonably expect their delivery upon his doorstep. He could, at the same moment and by the same means, adventure his wealth in the natural resources and new enterprises of any quarter of the world and share without exertion or even trouble in their prospective fruits and advantages. Unquote. He was describing a state of affairs not unlike the one to which we have been accustomed over the past few decades of hyperglobalization, wherein the flow of capital, goods, services, and people have transformed our world, helped by the spread of new technologies and ideas. These forces of integration doubtless boosted productivity and living standards on average, particularly in the developing world, and they contributed to tripling the size of the global economy and also lifted 1.3 billion people out of extreme poverty. However, just like his description of how the prosperity of Londoner was destroyed, quote unquote, by the projects and politics of militarism and imperialism, of racial and cultural rivalries, of monopolies, restrictions, and exclusion, we can draw uncomfortable parallel with the present era, wherein the global economy is once again being confronted with the challenge of geo-economic fragmentation. This time around, it is of a scale, scope, and complexity that is more severe in its impact than what the world witnessed in the early 20th century. Before delving into the nature and implications of geo-economic fragmentation that we currently face, let me seek your indulgence for a few minutes as I reflect on why the global economy has been experiencing the phenomenon of geo-economic fragmentation in regular periodicities. In fact, I would say that some of the things we take for granted, such as globalization and integration, have all been around with us and they come and go in cycles. Whether it is trade liberalization or trade protectionism, we tend to believe that the phases that we experience were there to stay in perpetuity. But that has never been the case because the socio-political context keep changing. And when it comes to economics, there are no constant or truths or theories that are held in perpetuity because in economics, most theories are only starting points of your analysis. They are points of departure. They are not the physical science theories, which are invariant across time and across space. Therefore, to think that free movement of goods, people, services, capital, etc., were always with us, and that they were devoid of the socio-political and the cultural context in which we operate is both a myth and a fallacy. In As I reflect on the global economy, more often than not, we bemoan a certain development without ever delving into its underlying causes. In other words, the tendency to lament at the symptoms without understanding the underlying malady, let alone treating it as one of the factors behind the rise of global geo-economic fragmentation. For example, in politics, pundits and experts engage in frequent and periodic hand-wringing at what they see and label as the rise of, within quotes, far right in several countries across the advanced world. But there is a deep reluctance to engage with the factors that gave rise to such a phenomenon. I submit that we are witnessing a similar approach towards geo-economic fragmentation. Despite the benefits of integration brought about by hyperglobalization, it has also brought about associated unacceptably high costs, high degrees of inequality of income, wealth, and more importantly, opportunities which have continued to worsen within too many countries for a very long time and across countries also in recent years. People have been left behind as industries have changed amidst global competition and outsourcing. Governments have struggled to help them. Rising geopolitical tensions and breakout of wars have further intensified these underlying fissures in the global economy. In a reenactment of the Cold War era, countries are once again getting grouped into two blocks or maybe more, and phrases like friendshoring have come to play a center stage in policy making. Tensions over trade, technology standards, and security have been growing for many years, undermining growth and trust in the current global economic system. So it is a compelling argument or hypothesis that fragmentation, economic, social, and cultural, is a direct consequence is a direct consequence of the imposition of policy, whether it is climate, cultural, and social, integration or homogenization by advanced powers or global elites acting through them or on their behalf. Whenever integration is not fair, it perpetuates inequity, resulting in public backlash. Income and wealth inequality have risen in many countries in recent decades, and these rising inequalities and related disparities and anxieties have been stoking social discontent and are a major driver of the increased political polarization and populist nationalism that are evident today. In fact, the increasing financialization of the world over the last 3 to 4 decades is a major factor behind the rise in geo-economic fragmentation. An increasingly unequal society can weaken trust in public institutions, as we are witnessing not only here but across the world, and undermine democratic governance. Mounting global disparities can imperil geopolitical stability, and inequality has emerged as an important topic of political debate and a major public policy concern across the world. I submit that there is one more causal factor behind the geo-economic fragmentation, because it is ironical where we need an integrated approach, we see fragmented approach. I am referring to the phenomenon called intellectual fragmentation, the lack of holistic thinking. The increasing intellectual fragmentation is one of the causes perpetuating geo-economic fragmentation. This is best reflected or illustrated in the increasing tendency to think in silos and forcing single point agendas on developing countries, whether it is on climate change, energy transition, trade liberalization, financial sector liberalization, fiscal prudence, inflation targeting, without reference to context, people's preferences, path dependency, the state of development, etc. As Paul Tucker, the former deputy governor of Bank of England, wrote, geo-economic fragmentation, I submit, can be traced to the rise of unelected power in the last 2 decades. The challenge with hyperglobalization was the failure to look at heterogeneities prevailing within and across countries. A seminal research paper that came out in Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2018 emphasizes that, and I quote, differences in how preferences relate to individual economic outcomes across countries could potentially be understood from the perspective of how preferences also interact with institutional differences. I unquote. The complex policy challenges that are confronting the global economy today cannot be addressed through a one-size-fits-all solution. Rather, we need to identify pragmatic solutions that account for interconnectedness of issues and are tailored according to country circumstances. Whenever this fails to happen, fragmentation is an obvious fallout. Let us start with a few first principles here on what the geo-economic fragmentation entails. Of course, we know that the costs are greater, the deeper the fragmentation. Reduced knowledge diffusion happens due to technological decoupling. Emerging markets and low-income countries are at most risk from this fragmentation, and transition costs are likely to be considerable. Short-run elasticities of substitution in trade are considerably smaller than long-run elasticities because it takes time and effort to reconfigure global supply chains, which is where the geo-economic fragmentation has its most impact. It is a reflection of the world that is facing a crisis of trust. That is my last point with respect to the important features of geo-economic fragmentation. These geopolitical tensions have led to countries shying away from cooperative behavior due to a lack of trust, resulting in a classic prisoner's dilemma. And this is reflected in the standstill that we are witnessing across several multilateral forums today, be it the WTO or the UNFCCC. Also, the geo-economic fragmentation is, and it is something which we can discuss, is a consequence of the geopolitical fragmentation that has tended to happen in history over time. We wouldn't have had the hyperglobalization or geo-economic integration, but for the fact that between 1980 and 2015 or so, there was a period of relative global peace and solidarity in the geopolitical space. So it's a question of whether geo-economic integration was a cause or a consequence of the geopolitical stability and integration that we witnessed in the earlier phase. So, for example, the world's best integrative phase was between 1885 and 1914, and then we went through a period of 30 years until the World War II ended. So, if you look at history, these phases of integration and fragmentation tend to come and go together. All we can try and do is, because human nature is what it is, all we can try and do is to lengthen the phases of integration which maximize the benefits. And in order to do so, we need to understand, as I mentioned earlier, the underlying factors that actually bring about this fragmentation. Without fixing them, we will not be addressing the problem of fragmentation itself. The growth implications of this, of course, are going to be considerable, and we have to be prepared for it. In a recent interaction in Stanford, IMF First Deputy Managing Director Geeta Gopinath said, trade fragmentation is likely more costly this time around because, unlike the start of the Cold War, as Professor Mitra showed, when goods to trade GDP was 16%, now it is 45%. It will also have important implications for global financial stability by affecting cross-border allocation of capital, international payment systems, and asset prices. How do we deal with climate change, more importantly, apart from these trade and financial stability matters in this era of geoeconomic fragmentation? The transition to a low-carbon economy, which is needed to mitigate climate change and meet the Paris Agreement temperature goals, has been affected by the supply chain and energy supply disruptions that originated during the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and the subsequent energy crisis that happened in 2022, and the exacerbation of geopolitical tensions. These developments and the broader context of the ongoing policy crisis can affect future decarbonization scenarios. This reflects through pullbacks in climate policies and increased carbon lock-in in fossil fuel infrastructure and policy making. The decreasing likelihood of continuous cost reduction in renewable energy technologies and the likely intensification of macroeconomic shocks and amid increasing fragmentation and the associated policy responses. More than 50% of the global greenhouse gas emissions are produced by China, the United States, the European Union, and the remaining G7 economies. All have target dates of 2050 to reach net zero emissions. These economies depend heavily on each other in trade of environmental goods and technologies central to the development of renewable energy and emission reduction. Hence, trade conflicts between these economies will pose significant risk to the green energy transition, imposing huge costs on the global economy. The Chinese supply chain for clean energy is so critical that as of now, meaningful global energy transition cannot or will not take place without China being part of it. In 2022 alone, China allocated 546 billion US dollars towards various investments in solar and wind energy, electric vehicles, and battery technologies. This amount dwarfed the combined US and European Union investments in these sectors, amounting to 321 billion US dollars in the same year. On the solar front, according to IEA, the International Energy Agency, China currently dominates the global production of solar panels across all manufacturing stages, boasting a market share that exceeds 80% and expected to grow to 95% in the coming years. On the wind energy front, about 60% of the world's installed wind energy capacity is sourced from China. High storage batteries are central to the energy transition. Nearly 80% of the world's battery manufacturing capacity is housed in China. The dominance is further exacerbated by China's vertical integration across the entire electric vehicle supply chain from mining to EV manufacturing. Finally, rare earth minerals are critical resources for high storage batteries and other high-tech industries. China dominates this space again, with more than 70% of the world's rare earth minerals processed by Chinese companies. Therefore, any trade frictions with China in the form of tariffs, quotas, or export controls are likely to result in Beijing's retaliation. And if the above mentioned commodities are part of the China's retaliatory measures, global climate targets will be negatively impacted. The IMF, in a hypothetical scenario, shows that where trade of critical minerals is disrupted, investment in renewable energy and electric vehicles could be lowered by as much as 30% by 2030 compared to an unfragmented world. This brings me to the last aspect that I want to reflect on today, which is the implications of the geo-economic fragmentation for global multilateralism. Current geopolitical realities are impeding the progress through multilateral consensus. Trust has to be rebuilt gradually through differential engagements depending on country preferences and willingness to work together. Where preferences are broadly aligned, multilateral cooperation remains the best approach to address global challenges. In areas like climate change and future pandemics, such cooperation is essential. But then it appears likely that the world may have to go through the adaptive valley, as evolutionary biologist Brett Weinstein put it a few years ago, that we may have to go through the adaptive valley of a geopolitical fragmentation and fracture before we rediscover the virtues and merits of reintegration, if we do. Therefore, even as we hope that policymakers retain a certain amount of agency to make the right choices, we should recognize rather, that hope is not policy. We need to consciously do the right things. For instance, despite all the differences last year under the Indian G20 presidency, we saw US, Russia, and China come together to further the G20 agenda, particularly with respect to multilateral reforms, multilateral development institution reforms. As long as countries keep the lines of communication open and engage with each other across multilateral forums, the world still has hope to address the challenge posed by geoeconomic fragmentation and work through differences for the common good of this planet and its people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anantha, for that brilliant and sort of very wide-ranging overview of this issue of geopolitical fragmentation and so on. Let me ask you a question or two first before I turn this over to the audience. And my first question to you would be on one of the topics you touched on, international trade and multilateral institutions. I'm curious about how you see India's relationship with the WTO and how you see India's desires with respect to the WTO. In particular, are we reasonably happy with the status quo as it is, with not much change and progress? The benefit of that being maybe that the Indian political system does not have to worry about these liberalization pressures on the one hand. Or does one worry that one does need the WTO and the disciplinary mechanisms of the WTO, the dispute settlement mechanism and so on in particular, especially in light of the types of possibilities that might now emerge from the US and the Trump tariffs and what he's promising to do if he wins the election and so forth. So how do you see the WTO? Would India like to see it strengthened? Are we happy with where it is? Sorry, yeah.
Thank you, Pravin. I think WTO remains an important institution, whether it is for India or for the global south, because it is one of the very few, or probably the only multilateral institution that operates on the principle of one member, one vote. So in that sense, developing countries cannot abandon WTO. They should use the forum, but the forum remains at the moment broken principally because of the dispute resolution mechanism process is not functional. Obviously, it is natural that in this country there is so much focus on the tariffs that may come if Trump wins the presidency again. But we forget the fact that the carbon border adjustment tax that is already on its way from the European Union and contemplated by the UK and also by this country. There are also other forms of tariff. Not only that, they also militate against the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities enshrined in the Paris Agreement. So I think we are narrowly focusing on only one particular set of issues related to tariff and forgetting the fact that many others who profess by global trade integration have already taken steps that actually undermine that global trade integration. So it may not technically run foul of the WTO processes, the carbon border adjustment tax, but it does basically bring in extraneous considerations, the processes of production into the global trade price setting process. So I think unless we kind of agree that all of us in our own ways are contributing to undermining, it is difficult for uh, people sitting in glass houses to be sort of throwing stones at each other. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I have one other question on something you touched upon and actually spoke in some detail about, which is China's primacy in the international trade system. And I wanted to ask you a question in relation to India with that, which is on the one hand, there's kind of a great hunger for Chinese high quality, cheap imports, going even beyond EVs and solar and so forth, just kind of your regular Chinese manufacturing output. There is possibly a good reason for India to integrate better with China, to be able to better participate in global value chains and so on and so forth, and gain its own foothold within the international trade system. And yet, at the same time, there are at least two worries that one hears a lot about in the Indian policy debate. One is the increasing trade deficits. It's a question of whether one wants to be concerned about that or not, but that's a point that comes up. And secondly, kind of a geopolitical concern having to do with reliance upon China, both as a source of India's imports as well as a destination market for India's exports. So, how do you see this sort of balance? Should we be doing more? Should we be integrating more with China? Should we be integrating less? And if so, what alternatives does India have for its own sort of development trajectory and
no, I think
for its trade?
it's a very multi-layered question that you have posed, Pravin. As far as India is concerned, I think we in the economic survey did raise the possibility, the economic survey that we brought out in July of this year, preceding the budget, that given exactly the interlinkages and interdependencies on China, we felt that India needs to be more open to both trade and investments from China rather than continuously relying on imports. It's actually a matter of self-interest as well, because if you rely only on imports, the tap can be turned off at any point in time by the exporting country. And we have seen China do that with respect to Japan in the early 2010-12 period as well. So in that sense, we were actually batting for slightly higher levels of integration rather than segregation or fragmentation.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. We open this now to the floor. Maybe we take 3 or 4 questions at a time, and then we have about good 15, 20 minutes. So let me start with the lady here in the gray sweater. We'll go to the gentleman in the suit after that, and then number 3 here. Thank you. Please. If you could please introduce yourselves briefly, and a quick question would be great. Yes.
Sure. This is Novena. I am a Columbia student studying sustainability management. And my question is something related to that. So, you talked about holistic thinking and climate change. So, I'm thinking in the context of system level thinking and sustainability. The current economic theories that we have, for example, the Kuznets curve, it talks of as the per capita income increases, the environmental degradation peaks and then it might come down. And the same goes for inequalities. So, do we still think in today's context that uh, as growth is the answer, and as we go up, maybe we will solve the inequalities and we will have the environmental degradation slow down? Do you see slow growth as the answer and not like going towards the perpetual growth? So, how do we integrate system level thinking and sustainability, especially to Indian context?
Thank you. Gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Rajiv Agarwal. My question is actually related to India. So I wanted to understand what is your expectation on the long-term growth rate for India, and what are some of the enablers that will enable us to India to have that growth rate? What are the enablers that will get us to that growth rate? And then the second thing is, given your understanding of India, it will be useful to understand a few areas that you think India is doing, which is not very visible to the rest of us, that you think has a lot of promise.
Thank you. Gentleman here, yeah.
Vijay Modi in engineering. Thank you for your, really wonderful presentation. I want to follow up on actually Professor Krishna's question. What was historically the reason why, whereas Japan and China after World War II, avowed enemies in the war, actually had a long period of technological cooperation. Last 10 years is different. How come India, China, which had issues, security defense, but not as big, never really seemed to have this sort of desire to complement software, hardware, other things in technology. And I see something similar with other countries, Korea, and so on. So is there something you can touch on in the history why that did not occur?
Thank you. Maybe one more question, Devashish here.
So you said that you're in favor of having closer trade ties with China. We know that if 2 or 3 years ago, India decided not to join the RCEP. So one of the concerns was import competition from China that would kill certain labor-intensive industries in India. Do you think that India should enter the RCEP now and try to kind of have a deal where China will open its markets to Indian services, and in turn, you'll have an open market for Chinese labor-intensive products. Is that something that you favor?
So let me start with the question by the lady whether slower growth is the answer. The answer is no. Slower growth is the answer for countries that have an historical track record of emissions to account for. Slower growth or better quality of growth. I mean, when you see countries that are very obsessed with emission mitigation and also the proliferation of AI data centers, which there are enormous demands on water and energy, there is a certain inconsistency between what they tell the world and what they are doing themselves internally. And that is where the answer lies when it comes to lower growth. And I must also tell you that in September 2015, the agreement on sustainable development goals were reached 3 months before the Paris Agreement on climate was signed. So both chronologically and philosophically, sustainable development goals must take precedence over climate goals for developing countries. And if we also need to generate our own resources for doing the energy transition, then we need economic growth. Otherwise, then the massive amounts of investment needed will only result in much higher external dependence and higher current account deficits, which the world will not fund. And the cost of capital will go up, undermining the entire both climate and non-climate related investments in developing countries. So that is not the answer. Now, turning to your question about what is the sustainable growth rate. See, last decade, let's go back to the first decade when it was considered to be around 8%. Given the global boom that happened, India's investment ratio went up. India's trade share of GDP went up a lot as well. Then came the non-performing asset crisis and the banking crisis, and the potential growth rate was marked down to about 6%. I feel right now we are somewhere in the region of between 6.5% and 7%. I personally don't believe that external trade will be a major contributor to India's growth in the coming decade, not so much because India will not be able to grow. And I think India's exports as a share of GDP, even if we exclude petroleum products, has been rising since the beginning of the decade until now, if you take both goods and services together. But I would think that the bigger driver of trade growth is global GDP growth and global trade volume growth, both of which are going to be influenced adversely by geopolitical developments. And therefore, as a matter of prudence and conservatism, I would not assume export growth to contribute 0.5% or 1% or 1.5% to Indian GDP growth. If it does, then the potential can shift to a level of between 7 and 8. So, but if India were to undertake more internal reforms, and Professor Mitra in his presentation pointed out about land use restrictions and the amount of high rises that we can go, they are very prominent examples of deregulation that we could do, actually. And I completely agree with them there. Then we can talk of 7+%. But right now, I would say 6.5 to 7. So, what are the enablers? The answer lies in, I would say, the only thing that the governments should focus on is what they can do within their capacity, and that is to deregulate. And much of the deregulation action must come from the subnational government, state and local government. That to me is a very, very big significant contributor to lifting the growth rates. Even now we have several provisions that impose as a penalty even imprisonment for simple violations of rules and regulations, etc. And whether it is with respect to land use or building restrictions, whether it is closing off certain areas of occupation for women participation in employment. These are all state government level rules and regulations. And we have touched upon them in the economic survey. I'm not going into other things like people might say, am I discounting the importance of skilling and higher education? No, not at all, but they're very well known, very well discussed. And it is not that India hasn't made progress. I mean, I think that's why it's a country that will continue to confound both optimists and pessimists. Because 2 decades ago, we could have said that enrollment was a major problem in India in higher education. That is no longer an issue. There is more than 100% enrollment up to secondary school. And if you look at tertiary enrollment, it was 6.7% in 2000. Now it is 28.9%. And in rural India, the enrollment of women is actually running much ahead of enrollment of women in urban India in tertiary education institutions and so on. So I think those areas which all of us talk about and know about are being addressed. And now the focus of the problem on education is shifting from quantity to quality, the outcomes. And even there, the CII VBox, which is a subsidiary of the Education Testing Service, ETS VBox, their employability test started in 2014, used to see only about 1/3 of those who took the test passing the test and becoming considered eligible for employment. That number has gone up to 51.3% now. So it's 18 percentage point shift in the last 10 years. So I think it is possible for somebody to say the glass is half full and somebody else to say the glass is half empty, and both will be right.
Sorry, on the question, did you want to say a word about maybe things that the Indian government is doing or reforms that have undertaken?
Yeah.
But that are not so visible externally and maybe that deserve
the visible areas of reforms are actually the very areas where I feel the state and local governments must be doing even more, which is the area of ease of doing business, because more than 1,400 laws have been struck off the books by the union government. And the other visible area, which is again, it's not so invisible, it's visible, the physical infrastructure creation. And I think when we talk of India's ability to become a manufacturing powerhouse, I think we shouldn't be too premature in writing it off, because in the decades past, inadequate infrastructure was a major problem, which did not allow the manufacturing share of GDP to rise. But now if you look at the turnaround time in Indian ports, which is not very well known, we talk about the road length and so on, that's actually even better than East Asian ports, not China, of course, but some other East Asian ports, including in Singapore. And we ourselves didn't believe it. We wanted to make sure the number was not a typo. When we wrote the economic survey, we were writing this, and I said, are you really sure? And then we went through twice or thrice. We wanted to make sure that it was indeed the right number. And it was the case. The turnaround time in Indian ports is better than in Singapore now. And that is a major contributor. And we built 74 airports between 1947 and 2014. In 7 decades since independence. We doubled that number in the last 9 years. So I think the areas where we have, and of course, the more important thing we did was to financial inclusion, which is again well documented. So it's difficult to talk about areas which is not well known, but then it's human nature to sort of, once certain thing is done, to sort of put it behind us and look at what is not yet happened. So that's fair. That's human nature. So we look at the aspirational things. But what has been done in the last 8 to 10 years on financial inclusion, physical infrastructure, and ease of doing business are the ones that have lifted the potential GDP growth from 6% to between 6.5 and 7%. And with respect to China, I did not ask for better trade ties with China because India's imports from China are already growing very fast, and therefore I am not advocating a membership of RCEP. I simply said in the economic survey that we need to balance trade with better investment from China. So I don't think RCEP is RCEP is the answer. What is the last?
There was a question about historical technology.
It will be presumptuous on my part to try and answer that question without going into the underlying causes that sort of explain the phenomena which you described. It is not as if India and China, in fact, I mean, we know that even at the height of the World War II, Germany and UK were trading between rubber gloves and binoculars were being traded by both the countries. And in fact, Germany was sourcing, I don't remember which one was sourcing what from the other, but these two products were very heavily traded between both the countries at the very height of the World War II. So in that sense, we have not stopped trading with China. Post 2020, Galwan, our trade deficit with China has still been rising. And we do import many of in fact, the biggest share of India's import basket from China is capital goods. So it is not as if there is no dependence or integration with China's technological advancement. It is not as if it has not happened. But where I think we need to do better with respect to that thing is, the penetration of Chinese market for Indian services is where I think we could have done a lot better. And with respect to merchandise trade, it is not just with respect to China, but with respect to everywhere in the world. I think India's good share of GDP, good share of trade, exports has to rise. And that is not just specifically with respect to China. There was a chart recently, I'm not sure if it was in The Economist. Only 3 countries have a huge trade deficit with China: US, UK, and India. These 3 countries share one commonality, which is that the manufacturing sector as a share of GDP in these 2 countries, the advanced countries, has come down. In the case of India, it hasn't risen. And for different reasons, of course, but the common element is the manufacturing share of GDP has been stagnant or come down in different places. So I think that is where I think we need to concentrate on. I'm not sure that India's phased manufacturing program is a bad thing because, as I said, the world is changing. We cannot be discussing some of these things devoid of the geopolitical context in which we operate.
I would quickly say on the issue of trading with one's adversaries, it might surprise many in this audience to know that India and Pakistan, way back in the 1940s, so 1947, when the GATT was first put in place, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, both countries negotiated specifically, there's a footnote in the text there, asking for them to be able to offer each other better trade deals than what would be permitted by the GATT in terms of their treatment of trade with respect to everybody else. So that's very much possible, and of course things have changed with time, but it's not an impossibility in terms of policy. All right, a second round of questions. We have 5 minutes. Our director has got his hand raised, so we'll give him the opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you for allowing me to ask a question. So I thought I would make a comment and a question. So comment is, Anantha implicitly complained that I forced him to talk about geo-economic fragmentation. I wanted to share one perspective. When I heard Anantha talk about this, I found that you were incredibly brave to not just be a friend of India, but to be a friend of the world, to talk and make the case for multilateralism, but from an Indian perspective and not a G7 perspective. And I think it's really, really important that as India is growing, that India takes that perspective. When I was working at the IMF, I would have the US, the UK, France come and talk to me about our perspective on even small countries like Lebanon. And there are huge numbers of people working in these countries, looking outside and taking their perspective, what's important for those countries' respective world. And when I heard you speak on these subjects, Anantha, I thought it'd be very useful also for a younger crowd to understand that India cannot just think about itself from an economic perspective, also its role as being a good citizen and bringing people together, as was evidenced in the successful communique for the G20, which was proving to be very difficult and may prove to be difficult going forward. And the question I just wanted, when Anantha said, "I'm happy to talk about any topic," we assigned this topic, but the second topic, which I think would be really useful, if you could just share 2 or 3 things, if you would like, on the Indian macro, which I think you are uniquely placed to speak of, that maybe that you want us to take away with, or remember what's going on, or what should we be looking for on Indian macro, uh, just for us as students of that subject. Thank you.
One last question from Amyutosh.
Thank you, Anantha. This was fascinating. My question is about domestic financial sector. I mean, if you think about fragmentation and you think about the capital need that we have in India, we need to develop, either we have to get capital from all over the world, or we have to develop our capacity internally to get more capital. So the precise question that I have for you is, when I look at the size of Indian banks, in a global sense, it's really small. We don't have one bank that is a top 10 bank in the world. So when you think about infrastructure and 7 or 8% economic growth, what are we thinking about that? And especially in the context of all the risks that you talked about. Thank you.
Macroeconomics and banks.
I'll take Amitosh's question first because it's a relatively less difficult question than what Ruchir asked me to speak on India's macro outlook. I agree with you. I think we need to have a clear roadmap, and that is why the budget was, when presented in July 2024, we did say that we will come up with the financial sector roadmap for India for the 21st century. And I think the question of what is the size of the banking sector that we need to have, how many banks we need to have. We have now a policy officially on licensing on tap, but how much bank licenses have we created? And public sector banks, I agree, at some level are an important part of the overall banking system. They, in fact, lend stability to the financial system compared to the experiences we have seen in some other countries during 2007-8. But they will be forever subject to the budget constraints of the government. And therefore, we need to have a better share of private sector banks in the financial system. And also, we need to also have a clarity on the balance between capital markets and the banking system in terms of providing resources for us. You have two extreme examples. This country relies exclusively almost on capital markets. China relies in terms of proportions exclusively on the banking system. I'm just taking some liberties in terms of to make a point. But right now, India has a good balance between capital market share of funding and the banking system share of funding our overall investment needs. So, but we need to have a certain vision, and this has happened not consciously, but somewhat on its own, spontaneously. But we need to think through this, given that we have net zero goals by 2070, and we have continuous, regular, non-climate related infrastructure needs, etc. That is why we have embarked on this exercise of having what kind of a roadmap we need to have, what kind of a financial sector we need to have, of what size, what capacity, both in the banking and the non-banking systems. So your question is an extremely important one, and we have taken cognizance of that. Now, with respect to, I'm looking at the clock, with respect to Ruchi's question about India, I think we do have a steady state growth prospect of around 6.5%. But for the current financial year, I can see some incipient signs of slowdown that are emerging. And I think we need to be mindful of that. That's on the cyclical side. Our real rate of interest may be, because after all, the current inflation process is being driven by just three vegetables: tomatoes, onions, and potatoes, which we call them top. So they are the top contributors to India's inflation, and that is distorting the overall food price inflation, overall CPI inflation, and therefore the headline and the real rate of interest. But the truth is, you take these three out, the real rate of interest is probably close to 3 to 3.5%, which towards the end of the second decade also played a part in the economic growth slowdown. The other thing I'm worried about at this point is the fact that India's stocks are very well priced, perhaps too well priced. And the democratization of the Indian stock market space in terms of retail participation has been an extremely welcome development. But everything has both its pluses and minuses. The minus is this: should there be a meaningful stock market correction, which again probably could be uh, driven by global factors or domestic factors in India, then the wealth effect on the retail investors will be quite meaningful, which has not been the case in the past. And that could have implications for consumer spending and domestic share of GDP in the next financial year. That is something we need to worry about. But on the medium term concerns, and I think as people mentioned about the need to accommodate agricultural workforce in the non-agricultural sectors, and that is where the inroads that artificial intelligence is making in India is a double-edged sword. I think low value added IT enabled services, if they are taken over by artificial intelligence, then I think we do have a challenge there. And in fact, India, along with many other developing countries, faces this impossible trinity of AI, fiscal prudence, and keeping the labor share of income high. We can only have two of these three at any given point in time. And that is true, maybe not only for global south, but also even for global north. I don't know. But I think we face that challenge much more acutely given our size. So these are the important issues. But what is going to keep us in good stead is the fact that the balance sheets are in great shape, both in the financial and non-financial sector. And the physical infrastructure has been a major game changer along with the digital infrastructure. So I am talking about the delta over 6.5%, which may come up and down, which may go up and down. And right now, I feel the risks for it to be lower have gone up rather than the risk of the upside having gone up. This is, I suppose, keeping the eye on the clock. This is the best I can do.
Well, thank you very much, Anantha. That was brilliant. Please join me in thanking him.